I gave up my youth waiting for a man who never returned. And in the end, I became something I never thought I'd be. For 15 years, I lived in withdrawal. My husband was ripped away and sentenced to life in a country that wasn't ours, and I was left behind with 2 children and an impossible promise. Wait for me. I did. God knows I did. I denied myself everything. I let desire die inside me, let loneliness carve itself into my bones. And every time another man tried to get close, I pushed him away like a recovering addict refusing just one taste. But you don't stay clean forever. You either beat the craving or it beats you. And one night, in the silence of a house too empty for comfort, I relapsed. Not with a stranger. Not with some man I could walk away from. No, my first hit after 15 years came from the one person who should have been off limits. The one person I swore I would protect. If you're new here, subscribe. Our growing community isn't afraid of the dark truths most people refuse to talk about. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and once upon a time, I was young in love and expecting my second child. Then the police came. They took husband, Edmund, away in the dead of night, bursting through our door as if we were criminals. The screams of my firstborn, Lawrence, still ring in my ears. He was only 4, small enough to hide behind my legs but old enough to understand that men in uniforms didn't mean safety. Not that night. They slammed Edmund to the ground and pressed his face into the floor where just hours before we had been laughing, dreaming. Drug trafficking, they said. Life in prison, they ruled. And just like that, I lost my husband to a country whose language I didn't even speak. I told myself it was a mistake. That this was temporary. That somehow we would fix it. But you don't fix life sentences. 15 years is enough time for a woman to grow old, to forget what it felt like to be kissed, to be desired. It is also enough time for the world to remind her that she is alone. I refused to move on. He'll come back. Those words became my prayer, my curse. They kept me breathing, even as they strangled me. I had offers. A widow without a grave to kneel at is an easy target. Men came with kind words, with empty promises. A woman cannot raise 2 children alone, they said. Let me take care of you. But I didn't need another man. I needed my man. And I couldn't bear the thought of another man raising Edmund's children. No stepfathers. No substitutes. Just me. So I worked. Day and night. One job wasn't enough, so I took 3. I learned to survive on 4 hours of sleep and the kindness of strangers who barely paid me enough to keep the lights on. There were months I had to choose. Electricity or food. My credit score became my greatest battle. One late payment, one misstep, and I could lose everything. But what they don't tell you about waiting is that time doesn't wait with you. It moves on. Friends stopped calling. Family grew distant. No one could understand why I was still clinging to a ghost. But I had to. Because if I let go, then what had all these years been for? Lawrence grew up too fast. He had no choice. He was my rock. My protector. The man of the house long before he should have been. When I broke, he was the one who picked up the pieces, even when it wasn't his burden to carry. At 15 he started working. A boy in a man's world, taking jobs meant for fathers, meant for husbands. He handed me every penny, never once keeping anything for himself. When my hands shook from exhaustion, he took the bills from my grasp and paid them himself. He never complained. Not once. But there were nights. God help me, there were nights when I would catch him looking at me. Not with pity. Not with resentment. But with something else. Something deeper. Something I didn't let myself name. Not then. It was a stormy night. I remember the way the rain hit the windows, a rhythmic tapping that echoed through the empty house. Lawrence had just turned 19, and he was no longer the boy who once clung to my waist in fear. He was a man now. Taller than his father had been, broader. His voice no longer held traces of childhood. It was deep, steady, the kind of voice that could ground you or undo you. That night, I had been crying. I thought he was asleep, but he wasn't. I had collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands, silent sobs shaking my shoulders. My body was weak from exhaustion. My spirit cracked from years of fighting. I didn't hear him approach until his hand was on my back, warm and steady. "Mother," he whispered. Not in the way a child speaks, but in the way a man does when he sees someone he loves breaking apart. I turned to him, intending to brush it off, To tell him I was fine, that I was always fine. But the words never came. Because when I looked up at him, I saw it. Not pity. Not concern. Something else. Something that had been there for a long time, hiding in the spaces between us, in the quiet moments when I let my guard slip. And then he touched my face. It was soft at first, hesitant. His thumb wiped away a tear I hadn't even realized had fallen. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't planned. It was a hunger, a need, an unraveling of everything I had spent years holding together. And that night I stopped fighting. I let myself fall. And there was no turning back. Dawn crept in too soon, spilling its light across a bed that should have remained empty. I felt it before I even opened my eyes. The weight of it, the irreversible nature of what had been done. My body ached, but not from labor or exhaustion. No, this was something far worse. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I would see. Lawrence lay beside me, his face peaceful, his breathing steady. He looked young again, like the boy he once was before life forced him into the role of a man too soon. But he was not a boy anymore. And I was not just his mother anymore. The realization struck hard, knocking the breath from my lungs. My fingers curled into the sheets, my mind screaming at me to move, to get up, to run. But I couldn't. Because running wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't erase the heat of his hands on my skin. The way he had held me. The way I had let him. I had been starving. And last night, I had eaten. I sat up, clutching the blanket to my chest as if it could shield me from my own sin. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the rational part of me that whispered, "This is wrong." But another part, the part that had been suffering in silence for 15 long years, whispered something else. It was inevitable. I had spent my entire life giving, sacrificing, waiting for a man who was never coming back. I had devoted myself to my children, to the struggle, to survival. And when I had nothing left to give, when I was broken and hollow, who was there? Lawrence. Not a stranger. Not a man with empty promises. But him. The only one who had ever truly been mine. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the thoughts away. But then I felt it, a shift beside me, the rustle of sheets. A hand, warm and steady, sliding over mine. I flinched. "Mother," he said softly. My breath hitched. I didn't dare look at him. "Don't," I whispered. "Don't call me that right now." Silence. And then, the weight of his hand disappeared. I forced myself to stand, wrapping the blanket around me as I moved to the window. Outside, the world was still turning. Birds still sang, the sun still rose, and people still went about their lives as if nothing had changed. But inside these walls everything had. I should have been disgusted. I should have felt the weight of sin pressing down on me, suffocating me. But all I felt was an aching emptiness. Because now that I had crossed the line, I knew the truth. There was no going back. We never talked about it. Not that morning, not the day after. Lawrence acted as if nothing had changed, but I knew better. The way his eyes lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his touch lingered a second too long when he brushed past me in the kitchen. The way he stood closer now, like he was claiming something that had always belonged to him. I convinced myself that it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment. That it had been grief, loneliness, and exhaustion conspiring against me. That I was still the mother, and he was still the son, and what had happened was an accident. But deep down, I knew better. Because every time he walked into the room, my breath caught. Every time he spoke, his voice seemed lower, commanding, different. And every night when I lay in my bed alone, I wondered if he was awake, thinking of me the way I was thinking of him. I didn't want to know the answer. For years, our home had been a world of its own. A fragile, isolated place built on survival and sacrifice. But now, cracks were forming. Neighbors started asking questions. "Lawrence never brings any girls home?" Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman next door, chuckled over tea. "Handsome young man like that? You must have raised him well, Eleanor." I forced a smile. "He's just focused on his work." But my hands shook as I poured her more tea. Because the truth was, he never brought girls home. He never wanted to. It wasn't normal. We weren't normal. And people were beginning to notice. The day my husband, Edmund, returned, The house felt too small. Too fragile. Like one wrong word would send the whole damn thing crashing down. I stood at the doorway, my hands shaking, my breath trapped in my throat. And then I saw him. 15 years behind bars had changed him. His once black hair was peppered with gray, his face worn by time and regret. But his eyes, those were the same. Searching. Familiar. Lenny, he breathed, using the old nickname no one had called me in years. God, He pulled me into his arms. The scent of old prison soap and something foreign clung to him, but all I could think about was the fact that his touch didn't feel the same anymore. Because I had changed too. Over his shoulder, I saw Lawrence standing at the top of the stairs. His grip was white-knuckled on the railing, his jaw tight. And that's when I knew, this was never going to work. Edmund thought he was coming back to his family. He thought he could slip into the space he left behind, as if time had been frozen. But time hadn't stopped. And Lawrence wasn't a boy anymore. He watched his father the way a predator watched another claiming its territory. At first it was small things. Standing too close when Edmund spoke to me, answering for me before I could. But then it grew. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Where do I sleep? Edmund asked one night, looking around, expecting to reclaim his place in our bedroom. Before I could answer, Lawrence spoke. You'll take the couch, he said flatly. Edmund let out a dry laugh. The couch? In my own damn house. It hasn't been your house in a long time, Lawrence shot back, his voice even. Controlled. Dangerous. The air crackled. A challenge unspoken. I should have stopped them. I should have said something. But the truth was, Lawrence was right. Days passed. Edmund tried to reclaim me. He kissed me in the kitchen, his hands searching for the woman he once knew. But I stiffened beneath his touch. It felt wrong. Like I was betraying someone. And Edmund saw it. He wasn't stupid. He was many things but never stupid. One night, I woke up to find him standing in the hallway, just outside Lawrence's room. His breathing was unsteady, his fists clenched. His voice was hoarse when he asked, "Tell me I'm imagining it." I didn't answer. Because silence was the loudest confession. The house couldn't hold us anymore. Edmund confronted Lawrence the next morning, his voice shaking with rage, grief, disgust. You stole from me, he seethed. Your own mother. Lawrence didn't even flinch. He met his father's eyes with a quiet kind of violence. I didn't steal anything, he said. She was never yours to begin with. The words were a death sentence. Edmund lunged. Fists flew. I screamed. And by the time it was over, one of them lay broken on the floor. Blood staining the home we had built on sin. Blood pooled on the floor. The coppery scent clung to the air, mixing with the sharp sting of betrayal. Edmund groaned, his face swollen from the blows. Lawrence stood over him, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. I couldn't move. My husband. Beaten. My son, the one who did it. My lover. God help me. Edmund coughed, rolling onto his side. His eyes locked onto mine, and in them, I saw something worse than hatred. Worse than anger. I saw the moment a man realized he had lost everything. You're sick, he rasped. Both of you. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. That this wasn't what it looked like. That it hadn't started this way. But we had long crossed the point where words could fix anything. Lawrence reached for me, his touch steady, certain. Come upstairs, mother. Not mom. Not mama. Mother. Like I was something precious. Something his. Edmund watched, his face twisting in horror. Eleanor, he gasped. You're not really choosing this. I was supposed to say no. But I didn't. I let Lawrence guide me away, leaving my husband, my past, broken on the floor. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. Edmund wasn't the kind of man to suffer in silence. He was going to tell. I saw it in the way his hands shook as he tried to stand. The way his jaw clenched, his mind already turning, planning. The police. The neighbors. The world. If he walked out that door, we would lose everything. And Lawrence knew it. That night, he packed a bag for us. We leave before sunrise, he told me. Somewhere far. Where no one knows us. I should have been afraid. But all I felt was relief. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't waiting for a man to return. I was leaving with the one who had never left. As we drove away, I didn't look back. Edmund would wake up alone in that house, realizing that the woman he had waited for was gone, that she had been gone long before he returned, and that his son, the boy he thought he left behind, had taken his place in more ways than one. I reached for Lawrence's hand. He squeezed mine. There was no shame. No hesitation. Only the road ahead. And whatever waited for us at the end of it.